The agenda this week heard how climate modeling works, learned why the Bank of Canada now considers climate change a risk, surveyed what makes some of the world's best cities great, and considered what should be done about the much disliked piece of federal legislation, the Indian Act. The agenda's Week in Review begins tuning into the Law Society of Ontario's debate over a statement of principles.
If you believe there is systemic racism in the justice system, then you need to do something about it. And she was comfortable with the statement of principles as an initial response to that. So let's start there. Is there systemic racism in the justice system in Ontario?
Well, that's a bit of a trick question, and I think the answer is probably yes. But here's the thing. What the Law Society did quite a few years ago was start a process to investigate challenges faced by racialized lawyers in the profession. And they spent, a lot of money, I don't know, 100,000, 200, 3,000, I'm guessing, on a bunch of studies, including a survey and so forth. And when this came up, I said, I must be wrong. I must be misunderstanding something. I've been fighting racism all my life, often at great personal cost, among other things. And every step of the way, I felt that this process was misrepresentative, manipulative.
The process of the statement of principles?
Of the whole study, and ideologically driven at every step of the way. And this is from somebody who started out sympathetic. And so I didn't trust that process, and now I don't trust it. And I think it's very unfortunate, because if that process had happened in a way that actually looked at, you raised the question of systemic racism, what is going on there and what are the solutions? That is what I would want. It's too late for that now. The damage has been done.
Okay, Karima, I think part of the issue the other side had, as I understand it, because we've done a program on this before, is that, nobody's going to argue against diversity, but the notion that you would have to, as a law firm, sort of tell what the demographic makeup of your law firm is to the Law Society, have that information published for them, and then they will rank law firms in the province by who's sort of meeting the targets and who's not. Many people found problematic. Do you see a problem with that?
Well, I'm not sure what targets we're referring to, because there is no quota system, there are no targets. It's about data collection, right? And what do we then use that data for? That's a very valid question. And I don't have the precise answer to that, but at least knowing the extent to which diversity, however we formulate that, is existing in law firms, that at least gives us ground to then tackle the root cause of any issues that may exist.
I misspoke. She's right, Murray. There's no targets actually set out in the principles, but can you imagine that some of the bigger law firms would have been, let's say, embarrassed had the numbers been published and we finally discover that Smith, Jones & Jones have only 2% racialized lawyers at their firm?
Well, I think, if I may, I think it's a correction. There are targets, and what they say is that, this is very important, racialized members of the professions, lawyers and paralegals, should be represented in law firms in every workplace at every level equivalent to the population. That's a de facto quota, which is hugely important. And if I can go back...
It was aspirational, though, I think. It wasn't mandatory.
Well, this gets back to, the whole idea of diversity. I object to anybody, as a lawyer, as a Canadian, a government, telling me what my principles are. I think that's foundational to our society. Many people maybe not, don't think about it as much as perhaps maybe we need to sometimes. But regardless of what those are, and you mentioned diversity, well, first of all, this does apply to every single lawyer individually, not just firms. And secondly, when you get into the issue of diversity, my friend said this was really about making us reflect on it. Well, I did. My whole career was, and I reflected on this, and I said, there are problems with the idea of diversity, the word. It's often misused. It's a code word. It's a mask for a whole bunch of other things, which I think are quite ideological.
Well, let me put
That's
the
just
math.
me. Yeah.
I get you. Let me put the math to Karima. If, and I believe Maria is right about this, if the aspiration is that the legal profession ought to look like the population it serves, in other words, half the lawyers in Ontario ought to be women, whatever the percentage of Muslims is in the population, that should be the number of lawyers. Whatever the percentage of Jews are in the population, that should be the percentage of lawyers. Can you understand why some people might find that problematic? Sounds like a quota.
Again, as far as it being an aspiration, I think some of the concern comes from, well, what about merit, right? What if we are focusing too much on diverse criteria, we're going to lose sight of merit? Well, I think the problem is that merit's actually, scattered fairly evenly across demographics, but we don't all have the same opportunity, right? When I went to law school, it was between $12,000 to $14,000 a year. If I was to go to the same law school today, we're looking closer to $18,000 to $20,000 a year. I would not be able to afford to go, and I would then not be a part of this profession. And I say that as a woman, a racialized woman, a Muslim woman, wouldn't be having this conversation with you here today. So the idea that if we improve the representation and we're closer to the community, that's somehow going to lose meritorious lawyers. I do not buy that argument.
I want to get a sense from all of the guests here today, who thinks the Indian Act needs to be scrapped entirely? Hands up, please. 2 hands. How about just amended and made better? Hands up, please. You didn't vote. Where are you?
Well, because I think there's another option.
Which is what?
I think the Indian Act has to remain in place until each band decides to develop a self-determination plan on how to get out of it. You just can't pull out of it because it affects every aspect of your life, from womb to tomb, particularly for people who are living on reserve. So they need options to opt out that aren't prescribed by Ottawa, and that's the problem. Is Ottawa offers, they said if you want out of the Indian Act or go beyond the Indian Act, you have to accept our other legislation under our policies like the self-government policy or the land claims policies, or the legislation that I referred to, the Land Management Act or other federal legislation.
For those who want it ended altogether, does his approach make any sense to you?
Well, I think, ending it doesn't mean just throwing people out into the country of Canada without any acknowledgement or transition plan for where we've been. I fully agree with my colleague here that there has to be a plan that happens, but that has to be through a process of autonomy and self-determination.
So some kind of transition.
That has to happen by the communities, and without that colonial piece that's controlling what people do. And that's really what the fundamental issue of the Indian Act is that it by nature impedes and prevents autonomy and self-determination, and something else has to happen, because I don't think we can go on this way.
So Bob, just so we're clear, if Justin Trudeau came to you tomorrow and said, I'm going to scrap the Indian Act and it's going to be done by the end of June, would that be a good thing?
I don't think so, and it's based on what we've just heard. To scrap it would create a whole set of other problems, and really a policy vacuum. That's what they're sort of referring to, and so. And then the next step, though, is what do we do to fill that policy vacuum? And that's the self-determination, self-government, self-reliance piece, which I think is totally achievable. You look at the Niska Nation, who have gotten out of under the Indian Act. They transferred title of the reserves. They got rid of the bands. They've got a larger land base and resources and jurisdiction. They actually agreed to pay taxes as part of their treaty settlement package. But what it's given them, instead of the Indian Act, is an ability to be self-determining. Nobody in Ottawa gets to tell us who our people are anymore. Self-governing, we're going to govern ourselves in a way that makes sense. So, they brought in some traditional governance. Their government is called the Niska-lisms government, and it's based on their cultural law and practice. And then the really important piece, and I think it's what was being alluded to, is the self-reliance. We want to be able to pick ourselves up and look after ourselves, participate in the political and economic mainstream, but in the way that protects our cultures and our societies and our nations.
You've heard, Douglas, a few different approaches here. What do you like?
Well, I think that these are all of these approaches are right, but I think what it belies is that the ease with which people talk about the problems facing Indigenous settler relations, as though this one thing is somehow responsible for all the ills in the world. The very real fears that Professor Stewart was talking about her children have nothing to do with the Indian Act. Those are regarding provincial child welfare laws. But they're nevertheless part of the pervasive web of regulations that affect Indigenous people. I just think that there is always going to be some kind of a legislative relationship between Indigenous people and the state. There always has to be, otherwise the assimilation project has succeeded. And so we need to face that reality, and then we need to ask, like, what are the actual problems facing Indigenous people, and how can we fix them? Starting with, should we get rid of the Indian Act, is not a productive place to begin.
One of the big wild cards moving forward in the next generation of more sophisticated climate models is the carbon cycle. What's going to happen to carbon in the future? Are we going to get more trees that are absorbing more of that carbon dioxide, more phytoplankton, or are we going to see major decreases in the health of forests due to pests, forest fires, a whole bunch of different things? So this is a really big uncertainty, and this is a really big wild card.
Last one, ice and reflection.
So this, for me, I think, is the most intuitive feedback, because we know what ice does when it gets warm, right? It melts.
Melts.
And ice is very reflective. It's very shiny. And so right now, those polar ice caps are doing a really good job of turning back sunlight that would otherwise get to the planet. So they're having a cooling effect, just like those reflectors you put on your car's windscreen on a hot day. And if you increase the temperature of the planet and you melt that ice, you're getting rid of that reflective screen, because that reveals darker ground or ocean below. And so that is another example of a positive or destabilizing feedback, where it gets hot, you melt the ice, you lose that reflective shield, and that makes it even hotter.
Can you estimate for us what percentage of scientists believe what you just laid out?
What percentage of climate scientists or
Yes.
overall scientists?
As you like.
I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but I have read a couple papers in literature that indicate that anywhere between 95 and 98% of scientists accept the consensus that climate change is real, it's here, and it's caused by humans.
So if someone were trying to advance an argument and essentially poke holes in all of what you just said, how should we regard that?
If they're doing it in the scientific literature, I would be thrilled, because I love to learn new things. And arguing that carbon dioxide, which we've known is a greenhouse gas since the 1800s, arguing that carbon dioxide has no effect, that requires a revolution in our understanding of physics. And so if you can make that argument, that would be very exciting. But I haven't seen anybody make that argument convincingly yet.
And if people were to say, the planet naturally warms and cools as it has since time immemorial, therefore we don't need to get as excited about this as the 95% of the scientists you just quoted say we ought to, our response should be what?
I feel like that argument is like telling a detective on the hunt for a serial killer that, oh, people die of natural causes. We know that people die of natural causes, but that doesn't mean that murder doesn't exist. We know that the climate has changed before. In fact, climate scientists have done most of the work to show that the climate has changed before. But that doesn't mean that humans are not causing climate change right now.
Let's do an analogy from a decade ago when we went into the Great Recession, and clearly far too many companies didn't make good, sound financial decisions, which resulted in, they showed appalling judgment, and it resulted in an international financial meltdown, the likes of which we're only recently starting to come out of. Okay, the comparison is, do you think the financial services sector this time will have good enough judgment to take the precautionary steps and assess risk properly as it relates to climate change, or are they going to need regulations in place imposed by government to make that happen?
Well, I think there's some steps that need to be taken by all parties, regardless of whether there's regulation to be applied sooner rather than later. And the frameworks for those steps have been established already with extensive consultations and broad discussions, so that companies, including banks, would have to disclose to their shareholders, which is the pension funds that are investing money that we've saved, that they would have to disclose two things. How is climate change impacting the company? and how is the company impacting climate change. And so those two things are what are referred to as the physical risks of climate change and the transition risks of climate change. They're technical words, but basically it's two sides of the same coin. And to the extent that companies step up, be they banks or corporations, step up to say, okay, here's our plan, well, that will make it possible for shareholders, pension funds and others, to know what those companies plan and what their assumptions are about climate change. And where they see that the assumptions are not in line with the way they think the world will evolve, then they'll invest, they'll take their money and put it somewhere else. To the extent that we don't have that transparency, then there are very serious risks of having a repeat of what we had in the global financial crisis. At the same time, we need to be able to decrease the sort of friction that exists in terms of other information. And that other information includes, for example, the scenarios that are published by the International Energy Agency and others that really are the drivers of how corporations allocate capital. So at the moment, we have scenarios published by the International Energy Agency, and by the way, they're in Vancouver this week to talk about just this subject, that are almost aligned with the goals of 1.5 degrees of warming, but not quite. And so if we can get that kind of information and make it available to the banks and make it available to companies so that they can then turn around and say, okay, well, our strategy to deal, for our business with these constraints on carbon and these physical impacts of climate change is the following. We're going to invest in electricity infrastructure. We're going to become really, really capable at renewable energy generation. We're going to perhaps open new lines of business that really drive energy efficiency in the building sector. Whatever it is that they decide to do as companies. But without those two things, we absolutely have the possibility of a repeat of the scenario that we had with the global financial crisis.
There is no perfect city, but did you come to a conclusion about which one comes closest?
No, because I don't think there is. If you want the best transit system in the world, go to Shanghai. If you want to see the best affordable housing delivery, then New York and London are operating in similar kind of ways, and Singapore has, as always, its own completely original idea, which is actually very effective. If you want to see the city that is a can-do city from sort of raising itself up from down below, then Manchester or even Belfast are cities that are doing it. If you want to see the city that best accommodates a really substantial stream of immigration, then Toronto does it best. So can you put all of these things together? I doubt it. I think, historically, perhaps, it's very interesting. I think city's primacy doesn't last very long in any of these categories, perhaps a quarter of a century, maybe a half at best. And you get the distinct sense in London that it has peaked and is going down, although frankly, it's peaked and gone down several times in its life before. New York is still in the ascendant.
You say New York City is the capital of the world.
Right now. Right now, well, just functionally it is, because it's the heart of the financial system. And that's the other thing that, by the way, you can't ignore. The financial services industry is the biggest industry in any city. And so how the banks are doing, how financial services are doing is hugely influential in the power of that city. A large part of me wishes that weren't the case, but that's clearly one of the fundamental drivers. And New York is still, not sure for how long, but is still the core of the world's financial services industry.
Sydney, Australia made your list. For
yes,
what?
Largely because someone asked me to go there, and I had it's a fascinating city because it's like Toronto with a decent climate. It's like Toronto with topography and this extraordinary filigree of the way the sea comes into the city. But when you walk on the street, the feel is identically that of Toronto. These endlessly long streets full of every ethnicity of restaurant you've ever seen in your life. Interestingly, the same kind of slightly muddling around inability to figure out how to get anything done that we've got as well. So it's almost as if there's kind of what I call a Commonwealth sensibility, that there's a way, peace, order, and good government but don't have any great high expectations. Except that because you're Sydney, and you're really, whenever you look at a map, you know, Sydney's way down there on the bottom corner, they have to wave a big flag.
That is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those conversations in full at tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and on our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.